Throughout the history of the United States Navy, several iconic ship names have persisted, and USS Yorktown is certainly one of them. Designated CV-10 and nicknamed the Fighting Lady, her story reached countless hearts on the home front through the iconic 1944 documentary of the same name in which she starred. For many, her exploits in the Pacific represented the determination and courage that defined the nation during the Second World War. Yet, the story of Yorktown did not end when the guns fell silent, as the Essex-class carrier served well into the Cold War after a brief period in the reserve fleet. Today, Yorktown continues to inspire new generations to greatness as a museum ship located in Charleston, South Carolina. Yorktown's keel was laid down on December 1, 1941, by the Newport News Shipbuilding Corporation, and she was launched a little over a year later on January 21, 1943. Originally intended to be named USS Bonhomme Richard, her name was changed on September 26, 1942, to honor CV-5, which was lost during the Battle of Midway. Yorktown had an overall length of 872 feet, a waterline beam of 93 feet, and displaced just over 27,000 tons at the time of her commissioning. Her flight deck was 862 feet long and 147 feet wide at its widest point. She had a deck edge elevator amidships on her port side, as well as 2 inboard elevators, and was equipped with 2 hydraulic catapults for launching aircraft, one on her forward flight deck and another on her hangar deck, and she was designed to carry an air group of around 90 operational aircraft. Yorktown was powered by 8 oil-fired boilers and 4 geared turbines which each drove a shaft. Rated for 150,000 shaft horsepower, she was capable of 33 knots and had a range of 20,000 nautical miles when cruising at 15 knots. For air defense, Yorktown was equipped with 12 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, which were located in 4 enclosed twin mounts near her island on the starboard side and 4 single open mounts on her port side. At the time of her commissioning, she was equipped with 8 quadruple 40mm mounts and 46 single-mounted 20mm Oerlikon autocannons. Her AA battery was updated continuously over the course of the war, and by late 1945, she had 17 quad 40 mounts and 65 Oerlikon mounts. Yorktown was designed to be manned by over 2,600 officers and enlisted men, including her embarked air wing. But by the end of the Pacific War, her complement had increased to well over 3,000 men due to the additional anti-aircraft weapons that had been added. Yorktown was commissioned into the United States Navy on April 15, 1943, at the Norfolk Navy Yard, with Captain Joseph J. or Jocko Clark in command. She conducted her shakedown cruise in late May in the vicinity of Trinidad, before getting underway for the Pacific Theater on July 6th. After a month of training in Hawaiian waters, she stood out of Pearl Harbor on August 22nd for her first combat of the war. She arrived at the launching point, about 128 miles north of Marcus Island, early on the morning of August 31st. The first strike of the day began roaring down her flight deck at 4:15 that morning, and over the course of the day, several strikes left the island in shambles and shrouded in a pall of black smoke. Yorktown subsequently spent most of September on the sidelines ferrying planes and equipment to Oahu from the west coast, before getting underway at the end of the month for another round of strikes. Early on the morning of October 5th, she began 2 days of airstrikes on Japanese installations on Wake Island. Yorktown returned to Pearl Harbor on October 11th and, for the next month, she conducted training and carrier qualifications. On November 10th, she departed Pearl Harbor to participate in the capture of the Gilbert Islands. On the 19th, she launched strikes on Jaluit and Mealy to suppress enemy air power ahead of the amphibious assault on Tarawa Atoll. For the next 2 weeks, she struck islands throughout the chain in support of U.S. ground forces, before returning to Pearl Harbor in early December. After being assigned to Task Group 58.1 of the newly created Task Force 58, She got underway on January 16th for operations in the Marshall Islands. Yorktown arrived at her launching point early on the morning of January 29th and began sending airstrikes aloft at 5:20 a.m. Over the next several days, her pilots struck at targets throughout the island chain in preparation for the landings on Majuro and Kwajalein that were scheduled for the 31st. After the Marines and GIs hit the beaches on D-Day, her pilots switched to a ground support role and continued in this manner until February 4th, when her task group retired to the recently secured fleet anchorage at Majuro Atoll. Over the next 4 months, Yorktown participated in a series of raids which took her from the Marianas in the north to New Guinea in the south. She participated in Operation Hailstone in mid-February. During Hailstone, her pilots helped ravage the Japanese fleet anchorage and installations inside Truk Lagoon. Aviators from Yorktown brought down numerous Japanese aircraft and helped ravage shipping throughout the lagoon as well. For more on Operation Hailstone, please check out the link in the description to a previous video where I cover the strike in great detail. On February 22nd, her task group struck enemy airfields and installations on Saipan before steaming for Majuro on the 26th. A period of rest and replenishment kept her there until March 8th. She shifted to the New Hebrides on March 13th and remained there for 10 days before getting underway for another series of raids. On the 30th and 31st, her pilots struck enemy installations in the Palau Islands, and on April 1st, they struck WWII. After another brief period of rest and replenishment, Yorktown set course for the northern coast of New Guinea, where on April 21st, she launched raids in support of amphibious landings in the Hollandia area. She struck Truk again on the 29th and 30th, before returning to Majuro on May 4th. 2 days later, she got underway for Oahu, where she conducted refresher training and carrier qualifications until the end of the month. After returning to Majuro in early June, she stood out with Task Force 58 on the 6th for the Mariana Islands. She began striking targets around the island group on the 11th. Yorktown's air crews concentrated primarily upon the airfields located on Guam. Those raids continued until the 13th, when Yorktown's task group steamed north with Task Group 58.4 to strike targets in the Bonin Islands. After striking Chichijima on the 16th, the two groups raced south to rejoin the rest of Task Force 58, as it awaited the arrival of the Japanese First Mobile Fleet. Yorktown's fighter pilots began their operations early on the morning of June 19th, when they conducted a fighter sweep of the Japanese air base at Orote Field on Guam, just as enemy planes were forming up to attack the U.S. fleet. However, just before 10 a.m., her planes over Guam were recalled as a 68-plane attack wave approaching from the west began appearing on radar screens throughout Task Force 58. For the rest of the day, her pilots would split their attention between shredding Japanese air power over Guam and intercepting successive attack waves sent by the Japanese fleet. By day's end, Yorktown aircraft had claimed 37 enemy planes destroyed against the loss of 2 Hellcats. As dawn broke on the morning of the 20th, Task Force 58 steamed westward as search planes desperately sought out the enemy force. It was after 3 p.m. when a search plane from Hornet finally spotted the Japanese, 275 miles away and moving due west at a speed of 20 knots. Admiral Mark Mitcher, the commander of Task Force 58, decided to launch a late afternoon strike, and 40 planes roared off Yorktown's flight deck just before 4:30 that afternoon. Her planes found the Japanese about 2 hours later and began a 20-minute attack during which they went after the carrier Zuikaku, a Pearl Harbor veteran, whom they succeeded in scoring several bomb hits. However, these failed to sink the infamous carrier. With the Battle of the Philippine Sea over, Yorktown resumed airstrikes on the Marianas on the 22nd and 23rd. On the 24th, she struck Iwo Jima before retiring to Eniwetok. She struck Iwo once more on the 3rd and 4th of July. On the 6th, Yorktown aviators resumed strikes in the Marianas and supported the operations there for the next 17 days, After conducting a series of raids on the western Caroline Islands late in the month, she departed for the Puget Sound Navy Yard on July 31st for an overhaul. Yorktown returned to the fleet in early November, and on the 7th was assigned to Task Group 38.1. Over the next 2 weeks, she launched strikes against targets throughout the Philippines in support of the Leyte invasion. After a brief respite at the end of the month, she got underway on December 10th for strikes on the island of Luzon in preparation for the invasion scheduled there for the second week of January. While retiring from these strikes, she rode out Typhoon Cobra on the 17th with the rest of the U.S. Third Fleet. Subsequently, Yorktown participated in the rescue efforts for the survivors of 3 destroyers that sank during the storm. She arrived back at Ulithi on Christmas Eve. Yorktown remained there until December 30th, when she got underway for strikes in support of the aforementioned landings on Luzon. On January 3rd and 4th, 1945, her pilots struck airfields throughout the island of Formosa, before working over Luzon on the 6th and 7th. They struck Formosa once more on the 9th. The next day, Task Force 38 entered the South China Sea, and over the next 10 days traversed the area at will, virtually unchallenged. On the 12th, her planes targeted Japanese shipping along the Indonesian coast, and they contributed to the tremendous score achieved by Task Force 38 planes that day. 44 enemy ships sent to the bottom, of which 15 were combatants. On the 15th, Formosa was struck again, as was Canton along the Chinese coast, and the following day, they paid a visit to Hong Kong. After striking Formosa on the 21st and Okinawa on the 22nd, she cleared the area for Ulithi. Yorktown remained there until February 10th, when she got underway for raids on the Tokyo area, which took place on February 16th and 17th. Her pilots bombed and strafed installations on Chichijima on the 18th and supported the invasion of nearby Iwo Jima between the 20th and 23rd, before partaking in more strikes on the home islands during the last week of the month. In mid-March, Yorktown conducted more raids on Japan as well as preliminary support operations for the invasion of Okinawa. On the 18th, she arrived off the Japanese coast and began launching strikes on airfields on Kyushu, Honshu, and Shikoku. She came under air attack almost as soon as these operations began. Just after 8 a.m., a twin-engine bomber attacked from her port side. The ship opened fire almost immediately and began scoring hits. The plane began to burn, but continued on its run and passed over her stern and splashed into the sea on her starboard side. 7 minutes later, another one tried but was also brought down by her gunners. That afternoon, 3 more dive bombers attacked Yorktown. The first 2 failed in their attacks and were brought down in the process, but the third succeeded in planting its bomb on her signal bridge. It passed through the first deck and exploded near the ship's hull. 2 large holes were punched through her side, and 5 men were killed, while 18 more were wounded. She remained in the area and continued air operations on the 19th before retiring to refuel on the 20th. On the 23rd, she began conducting strikes on Okinawa. These continued until the 28th, when she left to hit the home islands again. On the afternoon of March 29th, Yorktown had a close encounter with a Japanese dive bomber making a kamikaze run on her. Her gunners opened up and scored numerous hits, which was just enough to throw the attacker off course. He passed over the ship, very near to her island, and splashed about 60 feet from her port side. Yorktown returned to Okinawa the next day, and for the next 6 weeks, she sent her planes to the island daily to provide direct support to the troops operating ashore. About every 3 days, she retired to the east to refuel, rearm, and reprovision. The only exception to this came on April 7th, when the Japanese battleship Yamato was spotted by U.S. submarines steaming south. Yorktown launched strikes, as did the rest of her task group, and her aviators claimed several torpedo hits on Yamato, as well as at least 3 bomb hits on the light cruiser Yahagi, who was escorting her. The pilots also made strafing runs on escorting destroyers and claimed to have left 1 afire and sinking. By the end of the day, both Yamato and Yahagi were on the ocean floor. Sporadic air attacks, both of the conventional and kamikaze variety, continued until she retired from the combat zone on May 11th, but Yorktown sustained no additional damage. After a period of rest and upkeep, she was underway again on May 28th. She joined Task Force 38 for strikes on the home islands in early June, then supported the final push by Marines and GIs to take Okinawa. After this, she arrived in San Pedro Bay at Leyte on June 13th for another period of rest and upkeep. Yorktown remained in San Pedro Bay until July 1st, when she got underway with Air Group 88 embarked for more strikes on the Japanese home islands in July and early August. Tokyo, the naval base at Kure, and the northernmost island of Hokkaido were the targets of these strikes. Yorktown's pilots would fly their last mission on August 15, 1945. That morning, they were ordered to once again strike factories in the Tokyo area. Fighting 88 led the way with a low-level fighter sweep of Atsugi Airfield outside of Tokyo to clear a path for the following bombers. As they neared their target, they received word of the Japanese surrender and were ordered to suspend operations immediately and return to Yorktown. However, after they turned and began heading back, they were jumped by 15 to 20 Japanese fighters. In the ensuing dogfight, 4 Hellcats and their pilots were lost. These were Yorktown's final casualties of the conflict. Yorktown spent the remainder of the month off the Japanese coast providing cover for the occupation forces, as well as locating and dropping supplies to Allied prisoners of war. On September 16th, she entered Tokyo Bay, where she remained through the end of the month. On October 1st, she got underway for the United States, and after several stops along the way to collect homeward-bound servicemen, she entered San Francisco Bay on October 20th. Yorktown spent the remainder of 1945 on magic carpet duty, before being placed in the reserve fleet at Bremerton, Washington on June 21, 1946. In January of 1947, she was formally decommissioned. Yorktown remained in the reserve fleet until June of 1952, when she was ordered to be reactivated. In mid-December of 1952, she was placed back in commission, but in a reserve capacity pending the completion of her modernization. This changed her appearance somewhat, as her 5-inch mounts were removed and her island was redesigned, with her boiler uptakes being rebuilt and angled aft to accommodate a single radar and communications mast. Her armor belt was removed, and blisters were fitted to the hull to compensate, which widened her waterline beam. To better protect her air crews, their ready rooms were moved from the gallery deck to below the armored hangar deck, with a large escalator on the starboard side amidships to transport them up to the flight deck. Weapons stowage and handling facilities were also improved, as were her firefighting capabilities. She also received new 3-inch 50 caliber twin mounts, which replaced her old quad 40 mounts. On February 20th, 1953, Yorktown was formally recommissioned with Captain William M. Nation in command. She conducted operations along the West Coast through the summer of 1953, before departing San Francisco on August 3rd for the Far East. As the Korean War armistice had already been signed, Yorktown conducted training operations rather than combat missions during this tour. She served in the West Pacific until February 1954, when she got underway for the West Coast. After a brief stop at the Hunters Point Naval Shipyard, she put to sea to serve as the platform for the filming of the documentary Jet Carrier. This was not her first time being a movie star, though, as the 1944 documentary film The Fighting Lady was also filmed aboard her. Yorktown headed back to the Western Pacific in July 1954. In January of 1955, she was called upon to cover the evacuation of nationalist Chinese forces from the Tachin Islands located near the communist-controlled mainland. After heading home in February, she entered the Puget Sound Navy Yard in March for an overhaul and modernization. She received an angled flight deck, a hurricane bow, and her aft elevator was moved to her starboard deck edge behind her island. Primary flight control moved to the aft end of her island, and air conditioning was added for her crew. With her overhaul completed, she rejoined the Pacific Fleet in October and spent the next several years alternating between operating off the West Coast and deployments to the Western Pacific. On September 1, 1957, she shifted her home port from Alameda to Long Beach, California, and she was reclassified as an anti-submarine warfare aircraft carrier. On the 27th, she entered the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard to be modified for anti-submarine operations. Following the completion of this work, Yorktown resumed her routine of operating off the West Coast with deployments to the Western Pacific mixed in. During her deployment to the Western Pacific in 1965, Yorktown conducted ASW operations off the coast of Vietnam from February to April as American involvement in Vietnam began to grow. After returning to the States, she once again got underway for the Western Pacific in January 1966 and arrived on Yankee Station in late February. Over the next 5 months, she spent 3 extended tours of duty on Yankee Station providing ASW and rescue services to the task force. Yorktown concluded her last tour of duty in early July and headed home on the 15th. She operated off the West Coast for the remainder of the year and during the first 2 months of 1967 before entering the Long Beach Naval Shipyard for an overhaul. Afterwards, she resumed her normal West Coast operations for the rest of 1967 until December 28th, when she got underway for her last tour of duty in the Western Pacific. Instead of putting in at a Japanese port upon her arrival in the theater, Yorktown headed directly to the Sea of Japan to provide ASW and search and rescue support for the force that was assembled in the wake of the North Korean capture of the USS Pueblo, and she remained on that assignment for 30 days. Yorktown subsequently spent 3 tours of duty with Task Force 77 on Yankee Station during this deployment. She concluded her last tour of duty in Vietnamese waters on June 16th and headed back to the United States shortly thereafter. In November and early December of 1968, she returned to the silver screen once more when she served as a platform for the filming of the movie Tora, 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 which recreated the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Later on that December, she served as one of the recovery ships for the Apollo 8 space mission. On January 2nd of 1969, she began her voyage to join the Atlantic Fleet. Yorktown arrived at Norfolk in late February, which would be her home port for the remainder of her career. She departed for a Northern European cruise and a fleet exercise on September 2nd. Her port calls included Brest, Rotterdam, Kiel, Copenhagen, and Portsmouth, England, before she got underway for home on December 1st. On June 27, 1970, Yorktown was decommissioned for the final time at the Philadelphia Navy Yard and placed into the Atlantic Reserve Fleet. She remained there for almost 3 years before her name was struck on June 1st of 1973. In 1974, the Navy Department approved the donation of Yorktown to the Patriots Point Development Authority in Charleston, South Carolina. She was towed from Bayonne, New Jersey to Charleston in June of 1975 and was formally dedicated as a memorial on October 13, 1975, which happened to be the 200th anniversary of the creation of the United States Navy. I highly recommend paying her a visit as she is well preserved, and there are many intriguing exhibits showcasing her history. She has a number of vintage aircraft aboard her as well. Moored near her, and also open for tours, is the Gearing-class destroyer USS Laffey, which survived being struck by 4 bombs and 6 kamikazes off Okinawa in April of 1945. Check the description for a link to the video I made about her this past summer. Yorktown earned 11 battle stars and the Presidential Unit Citation during World War II and 5 battle stars for her Vietnam service. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe. It really helps us out and we greatly appreciate it. Thank you for all your support over the last year. It really means a lot.